Hey everybody, this is a section from Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union. Uh, I don't know if folks are, I guess I should say this every time, but I'm just reading these section by section as opposed to reading whole chapters. That's just because I have like a hierarchy of sections that I want to reread. And want to make sure that I get the ones that I need to hit for my own purposes before I hit other ones. And also, I feel like these chapters are kind of long, and I feel like people would rather listen to one section than an entire, these chapters I think could take like 3 hours to pull together entirely, so. Anyway. Castoriadis / Lefort. From 1936, the economist Cornelius Castoriadis, of Greek origin, formed an opposition in the French section of the Fourth International in collaboration with Claude Lefort, a philosopher from the circle around Merleau-Ponty. Footnote: the Greek economist Castoriadis lived from 1922 to 1997, joined the Communist Party, the Trotskyist group of Spiros Stinos after a brief stint in a communist youth organization. In 1945, Castoriadis emigrated to Paris, where he worked for a long time for the OECD, while being simultaneously active in revolutionary socialist circles under a pseudonym. Lefort, born 1924, I think Lefort is dead now. I don't know what year he died, but I'm not sure. Maybe he hasn't died, so I can't say. Had, as a student, already in 1943 formed an underground group tending toward Trotskyism. He studied philosophy with Maurice Merleau-Ponty as his main teacher. From 1946, Lefort and Castoriadis collaborated politically. End footnote. Because of the names of their respective organizations, the group was known as the Tendance Chaleux Mentale. They presented their heterodox ideas in two documents, dated 1946 and 1947 respectively, rejecting the Trotskyist theory that the Soviet Union, despite its many shortcomings, nevertheless had to be defended as a worker state against capitalism. Lefort and Castoriadis argued that, in the Soviet Union, a new elite, the bureaucracy, had conquered all power, and that this elite exclusively followed its own interests and not those of the workers. The Soviet Union was said to be a new type of society, which, just like Western capitalism, strove for expansion. Initially, the theory of Castoriadis and Lefort went in the direction of a, quote, third historical solution, end quote, a kind of bureaucratic collectivism. But from 1948 to 1949 onwards, they referred to the society ruled by Stalin as, quote, bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, apparently without seeing any need for justifying this theoretical change. Why they remained relatively indifferent about the precise, quote, precise, quote, label, end quote, to be applied to the USSR became clear when, in 1949, the first issues appeared of the journal Socialism ou Barbarie, a periodical which Castoriadis, Lefort, and their supporters published after they had left the Fourth International in 1948. Footnote. Note that Castoriadis / Lefort did not refer to, quote, state capitalism, end quote. Castoriadis later explained that he regarded, quote, state capitalism, end quote, as, quote, an almost completely meaningless expression, end quote, creating, quote, a disastrous confusion, ... for it makes one think that capitalism's economic laws continue to hold after the disappearance of private property, of the market, and of competition, which is absurd, end quote. Castoriadis. End footnote. The dissidents wanted to emphasize specifically the fact that, In the Soviet Union, exploitation and oppression had persisted despite the elimination of classical private property. Exploitation was defined by Castoriadis as the social relationship in which a social group, due to that social group's special relationship with the production apparatus, is able to appropriate a part of the social product of which the magnitude is not equal to its contribution to the production process. The Soviet bureaucracy, in his eyes, constituted such an exploiting group. The bureaucracy, after all, controlled the means of production and distribution system and ruled the social consumption fund. It thus embodied the supremacy of dead labor over living labor. That it ruled and exploited as a collectivity, unlike the traditional bourgeoisie, made the Soviet Union no less capitalist, because capitalist exploitation meant, quote, that the producers do not have means of production at their disposal, either individually, artisans, or collectively, socialism, and that living labor, instead of dominating dead labor, is dominated by dead labor through the intermediary of the individuals who personify that dead labor, the capitalists, end quote. The fact that, in the USSR, there was only one all-powerful employer obviously changed the position of the workers, because while the wage earners in competitive capitalism could change their employer, the freedom of the Russian worker was restricted. In general, they could neither leave their place of residence, never mind their country. In that sense, their position somewhat resembled that of serfs. If you listen to the Donald Filzer piece that I have on the channel, he talks about how, like, in the initial wake of, like, in the initial, like, 5-year plan and collectivization and dekulakization and all those kinds of processes that are associated with the Stalinist period. What was I saying? Okay, in the initial phase, there was massive, like, turnover in the Soviet economy. So, like, when these masses of people are filling into the cities, they when I said, what was I saying? Sorry, my neighbor's talking. And I can hear him. I was saying that yeah, the Soviet Union, the Soviet state, like, really clamped down on that during the successive 5-year plans, right? So there was, like, punishments and shit like that, and I can't remember, like, the exact, like, degree of the punishments or whatever, but fines, loss of rations, perhaps imprisonment, I'm not sure. I would say probably if you were particularly strident about it. What was I going to say? And so, yeah, but they set in a bunch of, like, labor restrictions about movement and shit like that, like the internal passport and stuff like that. Yeah, so anyway, these limited possibilities for mobility by the workers were connected to an almost total lack of limits to exploitation, while in competitive capitalism, the level of wages and other employment conditions resulted from negotiations between labor and capital. The Soviet bureaucracy unilaterally imposed those conditions. It was admittedly restricted to certain limits, e.g. the physiological minimum, which kept workers alive, but its ability to maneuver remained exceptionally good. For their part, the workers, robbed of autonomous organizations and reduced to a subsistence minimum, had only two possibilities of resistance: theft of finished and semi-finished goods, tools, etc., and indifference, expressed among other ways in producing goods of inferior quality. And yeah, the goods are being produced of inferior quality. Yeah, I think the emphasis here is being placed on indifference among, like, the direct producers, but I would also say that the breakneck pace of industrialization in the period that we're discussing here, which would be, I guess, I mean, I don't know what period he's precisely talking about. obviously when you're talking about the Soviet Union, a historical entity, you have to talk about different phases and different periods. But a big part of why produced goods were produced in inferior quality, at least in like the Stalinist period, was the total emphasis on quantity over quality, and which, if you have only quantity and no quality, that destroys the quantity as well, right? If you produce like a bunch of shoes and they're all shit, you don't even have quantity, because there's not enough quality for them to even constitute the purpose they're intended for. But yeah, but producing goods of an inferior quality, I would say that's definitely an indifference to the labor process, an indifference to quality, and amongst the direct producers, definitely was a factor, though. This whole situation, which could be characterized as a contradictory unity of total concentration of power in a small social group and a, quote, terrible crisis in the productivity of human labor, end quote, was, Castoriadis suggested, in one sense the fault of the Russian workers themselves. Namely, they had not understood that the expropriation of the capitalists after 1917 signified only the, quote, negative motivation, end quote, of a proletarian revolution. The positive half, after all, would consist in the transfer of all management to the working class. The Russian workers had not been thoroughly aware of this, and thus had, by their own actions, or rather their inaction, brought the bureaucracy to power. Quote, having overthrown the bourgeois government, having expropriated the capitalists, often against the wishes of the Bolsheviks, having occupied the factories, the workers thought that all that was necessary was to hand over management to the government, to the Bolshevik party, and to the trade union leaders. By doing so, the proletariat was abdicating its own essential role in the new society it was striving to create. With this approach, Castoriadis and Lefort, end quote. With this approach, Castoriadis and Lefort came close to the views of James and Dunayevskaya. Admittedly, they did not pose a number of questions which the Americans had considered very important, e.g. the question of the world market, but their stress on power relations at enterprise level strongly resembled the Johnson-Forrest tendency. It is, therefore, no great surprise that Chelou-Montal and Johnson-Forrest maintained contact with each other, and that the journal Socialism ou Barbarie published writings by the Americans. Footnote. The pamphlet by Paul Romano, Phil Singer, Andrea Stone, Grace Lee, was serialized as L'Ouvrier Américain in Socialism ou Barbarie 1949 to 1950, issues 1 to 7. In 1958, the group around James and Socialism ou Barbarie published a joint pamphlet. I believe that's Facing Reality, is the joint pamphlet. Yeah, it's Facing Reality, 1958. Where am I? Background information in Boggs, 1998, page 62. All right, that's the end of that section. Thanks for listening.